Most of you have probably heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you're anything like me, you've heard of them, you've heard that they're really important, but that's about all you know. And that was me for a very long time. I was like, you know, I've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I heard the Dead Sea Scrolls, I heard that discovery confirmed the Old Testament. Yeah, that's pretty good, but that's all I knew. I didn't know anything else about it. So it was a very important class tonight to really get into it and find out what they are and why they're so important. And we really do need to explore them in detail and look at why it's such a significant find. It's something I've said before, and I've said it plenty of times. There's more evidence now for the stories in the Bible than there's ever been in history. Before now, we didn't have that much. We didn't have too many archaeological discoveries that supported the Bible, and we didn't have that many copies of the Bible that were that old. So it took more faith to believe in the Bible not that long ago. Now it takes less faith. Now there's discoveries and evidence and proof, and yet now there's never been more doubt in the Bible. It's just this weird dichotomy that's taking place in the human race right now. So last week, when we talked about the Ark of the Covenant, I talked about this man, J. Randall Price, and he wrote the best book on the Ark of the Covenant that I've ever read, and it was called Searching for the Ark of the Covenant. The first book I actually read by Randall Price was called Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is actually the best book on the Dead Sea Scrolls I've ever read. And so that was early on when I started this archaeology research 2.5 years ago. This is one of the first books that I read. It's very long. It's over 500 pages. It's like that thick. And me being a bit unusual, I devoured it. I read through it like that. I was loving it. I was eating it up. It was just so fascinating, the stuff that was in there. I can't possibly bring everything in this book to you all tonight. I can't squeeze it into an hour-long class. But that's why I was like, okay, no more testimonies. But it's a lot of material, so I can't even begin to cover. What we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls tonight isn't even going to scratch the surface of everything that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything that has been found and is continuing to be found. So we're just going to basically give an overview, sort of a rough outline of what is covered in his book and what some of the most significant discoveries are and how they relate to the Bible. So first of all, we have a map of the Dead Sea region here, and the Holy Land has a very unusual landscape because Jerusalem over here, the city of Jerusalem, is actually a very high elevation. It's sort of a mountainous region. Bethlehem is a mountainous area too. They're sort of cities built on high hilltops and mountainsides. But the Dead Sea is this far away. It's pretty close to Jerusalem, and it is the lowest elevation on planet Earth. It's over 4,000 foot drop from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea coastline in less than a mile. That is a significant elevation. So if you look at the Dead Sea, we've talked about it a lot. The reason it's called the Dead Sea is because it has such a high salt content that life really can't live in it. That's not entirely true. There are some microscopic bacteria floating around in it, but that's about it. There's no actual like plant or animals or fish or anything in it. It's pretty much a lifeless sea. If you look up here, right on its coastline in the northern part is a city called Qumran. That's Q-U-M-R-A-N. And that's going to be the focus of what we're going to look at. This is the site of one of the most important literary and archaeological discoveries in history. All right, so this is called the Ben Asher Codex. So before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, this is the oldest copy of the Old Testament that we had. It dates all the way back in time to 1008 AD. Now that sounds pretty old, right? I mean, this is over 1,000 years old. But consider how old the Old Testament is. This document, this copy of the Bible is produced from 1,000 years after Christ. And before the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was the oldest Old Testament we had. So, like I said, that's what I talk about when it doesn't take a lot of faith to believe in the Word of God like it used to. So in our timeline here, we can see what a huge gap there was Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. Malachi was finished around 325 BC. So the Ben Asher Codex, which was the oldest copy of the Old Testament, dates from 1008 BC. That's a span of time of about 1,300 years. That's the amount of time. That's the big gap between the oldest copy of the Old Testament and the last book of the Old Testament. So it really, that's actually not that unusual in the ancient world. I've discovered this. Usually there is a gigantic gap of thousands of years sometimes between an ancient document and the actual historical event that document describes. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when those were discovered, now those are the oldest copies of the Old Testament we've ever found. They are actually placed right here, before Christ. Some of them are all the way back to 200 BC. Most of them are from 100-ish BC. So our oldest, with the Dead Sea Scroll discovery, our oldest Old Testament went from the Ben Asher Codex all the way back here to almost the time of Malachi. So we're actually now within 1 or 2 generations of the completion of the Old Testament and the oldest copies of the Old Testament. So it's a huge find. In the book, Dr. Weston Fields, who is the executive director of the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, says, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we are brought back almost within a generation of the writing of the last book of the Bible. If the oldest scroll is conservatively dated at 250 BC, and some would date the oldest ones as early as 300 BC, there is probably only 25 years or less between the time the last book was written and our earliest copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. This gives us a great deal more confidence because of the text and the way it was passed along, because we are able to compare what has been passed to us, which are later copies, but represent a very early text with what we have in the scrolls, however fragmentary it may be. So, what we're going to talk about tonight: who discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls? When were they discovered? Where were they discovered? And then the more important question is, who put them there? And why did they put them there? That's all the stuff we're going to look into. So, the real question is, the point of all of this is a very big question. Is the Bible that we have in our hands, the Bible that's sitting in front of you in your pew, the Bible you brought to church with you, is that an accurate copy of the Old Testament? Is that really accurate to what the original Old Testament says? The Dead Sea Scrolls are able to put our modern Bibles on trial and see how similar they were. So, first a little background info before we get right into it. The Ben Asher Codex is part of what is called the Masoretic text. So, from the 7th to 10th century, there were a group of Jews who figured out something. They said, you know, our language is changing. Hebrew doesn't really resemble what ancient Hebrew looked like. Now, they had old, dusty, crumbling, falling apart copies of the Old Testament, but they realized their language was changing. They realized those copies weren't going to last forever, so they said, you know what, we need to update this. We need to make copies, and we need to we need to update the language. And like I said, this project lasted from the 7th to 10th century, so it took about 300 years total for them to get this complete. And these group of Jews were called the Masoretes. And what they realized was that, I've said this before in some of the previous classes, ancient Hebrew did not have vowels, it only had consonants. Well, modern Hebrew has vowels, so what do you do about that? That was the challenge of, the main challenge of the Masoretic translation. They had to take old copies of Hebrew that didn't have vowels in it and update it into modern Hebrew with vowels inserted. Some of the words that they read, they didn't even know what they were. They just had to guess and research and pray as they made their copies along the way. So the Masoretic text, which includes the Ben Asher Codex, was the oldest, for most translations, of the Bible. Most of the Bibles, especially the Protestant Bibles, like the King James Version, and even most of the modern versions, like the NIV, used the Masoretic text as their Old Testament. So if you've got a Bible with you, or you've got one in front of you in your pew, the odds are it was part of the Masoretic text that took that from, its Old Testament is taken from that. So the problem is, again, there's a 1,300-year gap. So the question is, the Dead Sea Scrolls are 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text. So that leads us back to the question, is the Masoretic text accurate to the Dead Sea Scrolls? Did they prove or did they disprove the Old Testament that we have? Does it show that there's been any radical changes between the original Old Testament as it was written versus the new one we have in our hands today? So, this man was named Muhammad ed-Dib. The actual discovery is shrouded in mystery still to this day, but it is an interesting story. He was what's called a Tayammira Bedouin, if I'm saying that right. I apologize to all the Bedouins out there if I'm offended by mispronouncing their names. The thing is, the Bedouins are the oldest tribe of Arabs, and they're nomadic people. They live in the desert their whole lives. They travel via camel across the wilderness. They don't really keep time the same way we do. So you can ask a Bedouin shepherd when something happened, and they'll say, oh, but maybe about a year or two ago, and it was actually 17 years ago. They don't really keep track of time the same way we do. You can ask him how old he is, and he'll say, I'm 33, and he's actually 47, or whatever. So we've never really been able to be certain when Muhammad ed-Dib first discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, but by our guess estimates, it was probably about the year 1946 or so, somewhere in that range. So what happened was, Muhammad ed-Dib was tending to his goats somewhere in the vicinity around the ancient city of Qumran, next to the Dead Sea. And one of his goats got lost. It separated from the other group, and he was out looking for it. And he looked down in a cave, and he thought maybe the goat had gone in there, so he picked up a rock and he threw it in the cave with the hopes of scaring the goat out. But what he heard was the sound of shattering pottery. And he thought, well, that's strange. So he lowered himself down into the cave, and he found a bunch of ancient clay jars. And so he took those out, and he found these ancient scrolls inside of it. He didn't know what to do with it. This part of the story makes historians cringe. When you tell this part, you can just feel a historian just going, ugh, over this. So he didn't know what to do with it, so he started taking them out of the caves and he started selling them. He sold some of them to antique dealers. When word got out what he had found, a bunch of ancient texts, it led to a bunch of local Bedouin tribesmen descending on the area, and they plundered it. For the next 10 years, local Bedouin and Arabic tribespeople were flocking to the Dead Sea area and seeing how many of these ancient jars of clay with scrolls in them they could take out. And what they did to them is kind of horrible. Most of them, we think, were probably sold to local antiquities dealers for money. Some of them were cut up into various things. Some of them were burned and smoked. Some of them were cut up and made into shoelaces. It's just horrible to think about because this is such a valuable historical find, but they didn't know what they had. So the fascinating thing is, over the course of the next 10 years, the Bedouin tribesmen took more scrolls out of the Dead Sea area than we have actually discovered since then. And a great many of those have never been found. So it took about 10 years, somewhere in the realm of 1956 is when archaeologists it sort of got wind to archaeologists in academia what had been found there. So then the archaeological community went into major damage control. They went over to the area and they desperately went everywhere they could trying to find where the Dead Sea Scrolls had ended up. Like, they were going to local antiquities dealers and paying, out the wazoo for these things, trying to get them back and get them into museums. And the area was closed off. No more Bedouin tribesmen are allowed here. And so this led to a gold rush. So ever since then, there have been archaeologists flocking to this area of the Middle East, trying to find as many Dead Sea Scrolls as they can, finding more caves, finding more stuff. And fortunately, for J. Randall Price, the book, Secrets of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he wrote it in 1995. Muhammad ed-Dib was actually still alive. So he managed to track him down. It took a while. There's a whole portion of the book about him trying to find Muhammad ed-Dib, who somehow was still alive by then, even though about 50 years had passed since he had first discovered them. The bottom picture here is Muhammad Dib actually showing J. Randall Price the first cave. This is cave number 1, where the first Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So the next question, what was found here? What is so significant about this site? So, again, here's the Dead Sea, the coastline. It's about very near the northern coast. This is actually Qumran, the ancient city. So in this very rugged, mountainous region surrounding the city of Qumran, we have, so far, 11 caves have been found with Dead Sea Scrolls inside of them. The book was written, like I said, in 1995. There's a big section in the book about whether or not there's a 12th cave. And back then, they were just absolutely certain there's a 12th cave somewhere around there with even more scrolls in them. We got to find it. And Price concluded the book very optimistic. Yeah, we're going to find that 12th cave someday. And sure enough, just recently, while I was putting these classes together, 1995, so that's been, what, over 20 years ago, they did finally find the 12th cave. And fortunately for Price, he has actually been put in charge of, he's the archaeologist in charge of the excavations at cave number 12 to find what's there. To my knowledge, they have not published their findings yet. But I'm keeping tabs on it because I'm really curious to see what else they're going to find in cave number 12. So, what was found at the Dead Sea Scrolls? Only about 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually part of the Old Testament. The other 60% has been, there's really some amazing findings there about ancient history, historical documents. But as far as the Old Testament itself, this is our chart of what has been found as of now. A total of 223 copies of the books of the Old Testament. From Genesis all the way to Malachi. And this chart shows you exactly how many were discovered. So like 18 complete copies of Genesis were found. Now, some of these actually have numbers next to them with question marks. That represents a fragment. So there's been some copies of the books of the Old Testament that were not complete. They were just a fragment. So we can at least say we found another fragment of the book. So we have 18 copies of Genesis have been found total, plus 3 fragments of Genesis total. The winner is actually the Psalms, which is, there's been 39 copies of the books of the Psalms found, and 2 fragments. And that's more than any others. And Deuteronomy is a close second. So this has been a treasure trove. And as I said, these are the oldest copies of the books of the Old Testament ever found. Most of them date back all the way to 100 BC. Some go back as far as 250, almost 300 BC. So some of them are almost within a generation of the completion of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. Equaling a total of 223 complete books, then 10 fragments, so we're looking at about 233 Dead Sea Scrolls of the Old Testament total. Like I said, that is only about 40% of the total stuff found there. Some of the scrolls are ancient documents, some of them are just ancient records that give an insight into ancient history. Some of them are commentaries on the scriptures. There's just been a real treasure trove. But again, I've got to focus on the Old Testament stuff tonight. I've got to sort of stay on focus. I can't really talk that much about the other scrolls because that'll just get us way off topic. But, you know, if you want to read that book, just ask me. I'll let you borrow it. And you can sort of study and learn more about some of the other stuff in there if you want to. There is one book of the Old Testament missing, if you've noticed, if you can read this clearly. That's the book of Esther. There have been 0 copies of Esther found. Everything else, though, there's been at least one. Some of them, there have been dozens found. So we now have the oldest Old Testament, copies of the Old Testaments ever found in history. So these are the clay jars that they were stored in. This is Dr. Price with some of the clay jars that were found in the caves that the scrolls had been kept in. They vary in condition because some of them were not really stored properly. Some of them are just fragments just because they're so old they just crumbled apart over the years. For example, take this one. This is not one of the Old Testament books. This is called the Temple Scroll. And note the condition here. This was in pretty good condition. But now look at the top. You see how the top has been eaten away and stained? This was in flawless condition when it was extracted from the Dead Sea caves. But the antiquities dealer that bought it kept it in a shoebox. And you really shouldn't keep ancient documents like this in a shoebox. So that's the extraordinary amount of damage. And this kind of thing is driving historians and archaeologists crazy when they find stuff like this. But, I mean, what can you do? So, in fact, the number of Old Testament manuscripts at Qumran is more than double the number of Greek papyri of the New Testament, which has been 96 total. And these manuscripts are 1,000 years older than the Hebrew Bible manuscripts extant before their discovery. Well, we're going to talk about the New Testament papyri next week. But for now, this is how much of the Old Testament we've discovered. So some of the fragments are in absolutely horrendous condition, like this one, for example. This is actually the Genesis fragment. Now, if you can read this, you probably can, but if you can, the way the Dead Sea Scrolls are labeled is based on where they're found. This one is called 4Q2 Gem. And what it means is that 4Q refers to which cave it was found in. That was found in cave number 4. The 2 represents which copy of the book it was found. So this is the second copy of the book of Genesis found in cave number 4. And apparently there was some kind of fire that burned up the scrolls at some point, some of them. This is one of them, so all it is a charred, blackened bunch of scraps. So historians would look at that and say, we can't do anything with that. But with the use of modern technology, we can actually shine this with an infrared light, and the lighting that was underneath is now legible. So the same fragment after it has been photographed in infrared, results of spectral imaging are similar. This new technology allows the text to be read for the first time. So this has been an amazing discovery as far as the Old Testament is concerned. But this kind of stuff is important. But let me show you the most important find. This has been probably the biggest find to come out of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, total. This is called the Great Isaiah Scroll. It is the best preserved of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is the best preserved of any of the Old Testament books. And it's in absolutely flawless condition. Every word of it is legible. And it's the oldest. Well, it's not the oldest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the oldest that's in the best condition. This is a copy of the book of Isaiah that dates all the way back to 100 BC. That means it's the oldest, best preserved copy of Isaiah in existence. So let me tell you why this is important. There is a controversy over the book of Isaiah, and what it comes from is the fact that the proposal here that was given was that Isaiah has more than one author. Now, where does that come from? You see, the book of Isaiah accurately prophesies major world events, but not world events that haven't happened yet. The book of Isaiah prophesies world events that happened in ancient history hundreds of years after the book was written, thousands of years before us. So Isaiah has some amazing world prophecies that came true. So if you believe the Bible is the Word of God, that's great. That's good for you. But if you're a skeptic who doesn't believe in the Bible, that's bad for you. So to try to explain this, in the late 1700s, there were 2 textual critics. Their names were J.C. Doederlein and J.G. Eichhorn. And they proposed that maybe Isaiah has more than one author. And what this comes from, the first 39 books of Isaiah, chapters of Isaiah, have a consistent narrative. They take place in the same time period, which is pre-Assyrian invasion Jerusalem. So roughly during the reign of King Hezekiah, while the Assyrians are coming to invade, while the people are afraid. And Isaiah is warning the people and warning King Hezekiah to repent, and they'll be spared from the Assyrian invasion. Isaiah references himself several times in the first 39 books. So, if you remember from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 39 ends with Sennacherib being defeated. The angel of the Lord comes and he destroys the Assyrian army. And then everybody's happy and singing and dancing, and it has a happy ending. From Isaiah 40 to 66, so after Isaiah 39, the book of Isaiah changes a little bit. It's not really taking place in a historical time period. It's very poetic and it's very prophetic. It mentions future events such as the Babylonian invasion that took place centuries after Isaiah's death. And in these books, Isaiah never references himself. So what Doberlein and Eichhorn proposed is that Isaiah, the prophet, only wrote the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 40 through 66 were written by another prophet during the Babylonian invasion, pretending basically to be prophecy of world events. And what this does, if you don't believe that the Bible has any supernatural value to it, this helps you explain how Isaiah was able to prophesy these great world events. Now, obviously, this has been very controversial because it's based on the assumption that the book is not prophetic. And it's trying to find a natural explanation for the great supernatural prophecies of the Bible, and especially of the book of Isaiah. So all of this was proposed before the Dead Sea Scroll discovery. So you would think that the Isaiah scroll would help settle the debate once and for all. And it has. So if you go back and look at the Isaiah, the great Isaiah scroll, this is now the oldest copy of the book of Isaiah we have. It's thousands of years older than any copy of Isaiah that Eichhorn or Doderlein had. And the copier of this book was extremely meticulous. I mean, meticulous to an extreme degree. If you look over this, this copy of Isaiah, not only is it absolutely copied perfectly, word for word, very carefully, very neatly, and very organized, it also contains notes and margins and commentaries. See, the idea of having a commentary on the Bible isn't a new idea. You know, it's not just in your Bibles today. They were doing that thousands of years ago. So there's actually little footnotes at the bottom where the copier was inserting little footnotes and writing things here and there. And he was, whoever he was extremely, extremely OCD-ish about it. He noted every little tiny detail of the book of Isaiah throughout this entire scroll. It's probably one of the best commentaries on Isaiah ever written. Whoever wrote it, we don't know for sure who he was, just some scribe from thousands of years ago. This guy was so meticulous that he points out some of the textual discrepancies. For example, 2 Kings chapter 20 tells the account of the healing of the king Hezekiah. Remember, Hezekiah was sick unto death, and God gave him 15 more years, and the shadow of the sundial turned backwards. So Isaiah 38 covers that as well, but the accounts are slightly different. They have a little bit of a contradiction between the two of them. So the copier of Isaiah was so meticulous that even this little detail, he made very vigorous note of it. He noted it in very, very good detail down at the bottom of the page. But this being the oldest copy of Isaiah, dating back to 100 BC, there is no mention whatsoever of two authors. There is absolutely none. So if that was the case, if Isaiah was written by two authors, this copier had no idea. He said nothing on the matter. And there's really kind of just a fluidity between chapter 39 and chapter 40. Chapter 39 ends and it jumps straight to chapter 40 without missing a beat. So based on the evidence we found from the oldest copy of Isaiah, Eichhorn's theory really doesn't hold water. The evidence that we have found now kind of disputes what Eichhorn said, which means that Isaiah does have one author and not two, which means that Isaiah did prophesy world events hundreds of years before they actually happened. But there's an even bigger, this has helped us give support for the idea of a unified Isaiah, and those who still believe in the two authors of Isaiah really don't have a leg to stand on anymore. But there's an even bigger one than that. And this is over the book of Daniel. So we can't really find a single copy. There is no great Daniel scroll. We've actually have, the book of Daniel is in 4 different fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what we had to do, what scientists have had to do is sort of put them together. Even though they weren't all 4 written at the same time, the 4 of them put together like a puzzle constitutes the oldest copy of Daniel we have. So there's a similar controversy here. Daniel prophesies world's events even better than Isaiah does, in exactly more detail than Daniel did. So, the book of Daniel is written immediately after the siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC. That's when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. The people went into exile. Daniel was a prophet with him. Daniel was written from about midway through the Babylonian Empire all the way through this point in the Medo-Persian Empire. And it prophesies world events in the future. It prophesies, let me go back. So if you read Daniel and study it, and I taught a class on it once a long time ago, Daniel prophesies the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire hundreds of years before it happened. It prophesies the rise and fall of Alexander the Great in exact detail. And it even says what would happen to his empire after he died. And it even says this is the king of Greece that this will happen to. Then it prophesies the 6 Syrian wars. The entire chapter, 11th chapter of Daniel is devoted to the 6 Syrian wars, the wars that took place after the death of Alexander the Great, when his empire was divided and the 4 parts of that empire went to war with one another, and the children of Israel were caught in the middle of those wars. This occurs between 320 and 167 BC. Then it predicts the Maccabean revolt. This is when the evil king of Seleucia, Antiochus Epiphanes, conquered Jerusalem and absolutely savagely attacked it and just stormed the city. The people of Jerusalem were totally defenseless. They didn't even have an army. And this cruel king seized the city, and he killed women and children. He put a statue of himself in the temple and demanded worship as God. And so the Maccabeans, Judah Maccabeus, led a revolt against the king and said, enough is enough. And they were hopelessly outnumbered, but it was one of the great miraculous deliveries in human history when Judah Maccabeus led a small team, a small ragtag band of Jewish fighters who took on the most powerful army on earth and totally defeated them through the power of prayer. And when the Seleucids were driven out and Antiochus' army retreated, the Jews rededicated their temple. And to this day, they celebrate Hanukkah to commemorate the rededication of the temple and their survival as a people. So the book of Daniel prophesies all of this, and it was written hundreds of years before it happened. So here's the thing. This was also a proposal by J.G. Eichhorn. He proposed to explain how Daniel could have prophesied such great world events so many years before they happened. He proposed that it's completely a fictional book, that Daniel the prophet never existed, and that his claim is that it was written during the Maccabean revolt, that the Jews were trying to rally themselves and restore national pride and patriotism, so they made up a fictional character, Daniel, and made up the whole story and placed it hundreds of years in the past during the Babylonian Empire. And the point of it was to show the Jews that they are a special people, they're God's chosen people, they have a special place in history and all of that. So he would have dated the Maccabean revolt at about 137 BC. And then around that time is when the book of Daniel would have been written. And that's how the book of Daniel prophesies such great world events, because it was written after they took place. So that was Eichhorn's proposal. Now sadly, this has been accepted as absolute fact in much of the scholarly community. And I've debated people about it before. Most atheists and skeptics who have even a little bit of passing knowledge about Bible history will absolutely swear this is the truth. They're like, yes, it's absolutely a proven fact that, yes, Daniel was written during the Maccabean period and it's all a complete fiction, and that's how it prophesied such major world events. So once again, we ask the question, does the Dead Sea Scroll, does that discovery help settle the matter? Yes, it does. The 4 copies of Daniel that we've been able to put together date far back before the Maccabean revolt. Now, they don't date all the way back to the death of Alexander, but at the very oldest, at the very youngest, the Daniel scroll is from about 30 years before the Maccabean revolt. And at the very oldest, it dates back to about 200 BC, somewhere in this range. So while it is still, this copy of the book of Daniel is still after all these world events, it's before the Maccabean revolt. So that proves that it's not a fictional story created during the Maccabean revolt. But as I said, Daniel does prophesy the Maccabean revolt and the fall and the defeat of Antiochus Epiphanes. So what I would wonder is if we now can prove that Daniel was written before that, that should kind of settle the matter, shouldn't it? And it's amazing that despite this, despite the Dead Sea Scroll discovery, it really hasn't changed that many skeptics' mind. They're still adamant that the book of Daniel was written during the Maccabean period. And I've debated a few of them online over this, and I've even pointed this out to them, and I didn't really get a response. They just were absolutely sure it was written during the Maccabean period. I would point out something else. For one thing, the Dead Sea Scrolls were compiled by some very, very radical Jews. We're going to learn about that later. These Jews were absolutely radical. I'm going to dare say they were a cult of Jews. These people highly revered prophets. Highly revered prophets. They had absolute respect for prophets like Daniel and Isaiah. If Daniel was a fictional character, they would have never made copies of his book. And in fact, if Daniel is a fiction, I don't even think it would be in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because they would have never accepted a fictional character. But it's clear from the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries that they viewed Daniel as a great prophet. But that's not even the point I want to make. Because I'm going to show you where Eichhorn's proposal completely falls apart. He put the book of Daniel, written somewhere around this time period, to explain how it prophesies world events from here, here, and here. But Daniel doesn't just prophesy those. He also prophesies events after the Maccabean revolt. Daniel prophesies the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire didn't start coming to power, Julius Caesar, in 100 BC. You know, we've studied Daniel before. During Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he sees the world kingdoms from the past to the future, to the end times. The Roman Empire was symbolized by the iron legs of the statue, because Rome was a great iron empire. And the fact that it had two legs, Rome was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus. And that's why there were two legs to the statue. So Daniel prophesied that hundreds of years before it happened. Putting Daniel in the Maccabean period doesn't solve your problem of how Daniel prophesied world events. It falls completely short of that. And furthermore, Daniel also saw the Roman Empire as a great monster with iron claws coming out of the sea. And he also prophesied Jesus. And he told exactly when Jesus was going to come onto the scene. And especially since the Dead Sea Scroll discovery places Daniel before the Maccabean revolt, I just don't see. And what we're starting to see as we look at this, the supernatural nature of the Bible is starting to become apparent. The Bible in Isaiah and Daniel especially successfully prophesied major world events hundreds of years before they happen, and now that's proven. It's a proven fact now. You can't keep denying it. And that to me is why the Dead Sea Scrolls have become such a huge discovery. And it's amazing to me that skeptical readers, Bible critics, really, they just won't accept it. Even when the evidence is shoved right in their face, they still won't accept it without any real clear reason of why they won't accept it. So now that we've settled that, the supernatural nature of the Bible is becoming clear and undeniable at this point. So now the next question is, that we're going to dive into, who put the Dead Sea Scrolls here? Who actually wrote them down and copied them, and why did they do it? So, we talked about Flavius Josephus, the great Jewish historian from Roman times, lived in sort of during the life of Christ, but mostly immediately afterwards. Josephus identified 4 Jewish groups that were alive at the time, especially during the time of Christ, in early Roman-occupied, 1st century Palestine. Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we know about them. They're in the New Testament a lot. He identified a 3rd group, the Zealot. Those are in the New Testament too. The Pharisees and Sadducees, they were the Sanhedrin, the high priest, the Jewish religious hierarchy. The Zealots were the radical Jews that wanted to take up arms and overthrow the Romans. But then, these are the only 3 that are identified in the New Testament. There's a 4th group that Josephus identified. He called them the Essenes. The word Essenes comes from the Hebrew Isa, which means community. And he dates them from about 167 to, I actually put a typo here, 167 BC to 70 AD. So, who are the Essenes? They're not actually mentioned in the New Testament or in the Bible anywhere. So let's take a closer look at these people. All right, so to figure out who exactly the Essenes were, we have to kind of look at this timeline a little closer. So we know Solomon built the first temple in 986 BC. Then about 400 years later, 586 BC, the temple is destroyed. We've talked about this in the previous classes. The Ark of the Covenant is taken. Solomon's temple is razed to the ground. Jerusalem is destroyed. Then 70 years later, the Jews are in exile in Babylon and then in Medo-Persia for 70 years. In 518 BC, they are allowed to return to their homeland. This is sometimes referred to as the Second Exodus. So they rebuild the temple. The problem is this ushers in what's called Second Temple, the Second Temple period, or Second Temple Judaism. The problem is they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant anymore, and it's never been found since. So the Jews rebuilt the temple, and they rededicated it, but they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant to put in it. So some Jews said, wait a minute, you can't have the temple without the Ark of the Covenant. You can't make sacrifices, and you can't sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat. So there was a group of Jews who adamantly refused to take part in the Second Temple rituals. And eventually they separated themselves from Jerusalem and from the other Jewish people altogether. And they built an isolated community, and they became the Essenic Jews. And like I said, that comes from the word Esau, which means community in Hebrew. So Josephus dates them at about 167 BC. They last from here to about the time the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. We don't know a whole lot about them because they were very mysterious and very secretive. Like I said, they were really a cult of radical Jews who just thought that the Second Temple was blasphemy. It was blasphemy to rebuild the temple and start sacrifices again without the Ark of the Covenant. So they formed an isolated community, and they really kept to themselves. They were very secretive. And eventually they all died out, and it's kind of interesting as to why they died out, because they believed that they were living in the last days, and they believed that the end of the world was coming soon. They started to get more and more apocalyptic over time. And the Essenic Jews eventually died out because they stopped getting married and having children, because they believed it was wrong to have children in the end times when the world was about to end. And there weren't that many of them left by 70 AD. When the Romans came down and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the kingdom of Judah for good, the Essenes didn't stand a chance. This was the moment when they were all wiped out. So, during their time period, even though they were a radical cult, they still left quite a historical legacy. Because during their existence, they translated the Bible, the Old Testament, many, many, many times. And they didn't just translate the Bible, they wrote dozens of commentaries on them. They wrote hundreds of teachings. They give us some of the deepest insight into this period of the ancient world that we have ever found. And a lot of our understanding of the history comes from the discoveries we've made of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet, we don't know for 100% certainty if the Essenes were the people who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we call the people who left the Dead Sea Scrolls the Qumranites because they were from Qumran. We can't say with 100% certainty that the Essenes were the Qumranites, because the translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls never referred to themselves as the Essenes, but they still probably were. We can say it with about 99% certainty, just because of a lack of process of elimination. There's really nobody else that they could have been. So, despite their isolation, they still built quite a legacy. Which now that we know who probably copied and wrote the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the next question is why? What did they do it for? So we found the Dead Sea Scrolls have caused us to go back to the Qumran, the ancient city ruins, and really excavate it well to find out more about these people and why they translated the Bible and how they did it. And we found out that they were so devoted to translating the Old Testament and preserving it, they had buildings devoted to it, and these were called scriptoriums. And you can see the process. It was a very, very rigorous process. It is said that they were so intent on preserving the Word of God that they were so afraid of doing something wrong or making a mistake that they would measure the space, the distance in between each letter before they would make a copy. It was like blasphemy if you even got the letter off by a little bit, the spacing between each letter. And we should be grateful to that because they've left us the most accurately well-preserved Old Testament in history. The buildings, the scriptoriums, had 2 stories. We can see the translation would start here. We've been able to reconstruct it based on what we found. So these are the guys actually making the paper, the leather parchments, the animal skin, inking it, and it went through a lot of committees to make sure every word was absolutely right and absolutely perfect. Then it would move upstairs to the upper level where you can see people stitching it together and making the rolls. And then you can see at the top, this was the final process. When the scrolls were completed, they were put in these libraries. They had very impressive libraries, and there's more than one of these scriptoriums in the ancient city of Qumran. So they had a lot of copies of the Old Testament and a lot of ancient writings. They had possibly thousands of them, because every one had these impressive libraries in them, just walls and walls of shelves of ancient scrolls over and over again. So they really did a thorough job in translating and preserving the Old Testament. So the next question is, at some point or another, they started taking the scrolls out of these scriptoriums, out of these libraries, and moving them into the caves around the Dead Sea and storing them there. Why? What in the world for? What was the point? Well, remember what I said. The Essenes had at some point become a radical cult of Jews. And we find this out about them from their writings, about themselves. And we can tell they were a very isolated community. They refused to take part in the temple rituals. They had their own temple rituals. They started to believe over time that only they were the true Jews, that the rest of the Jews were imposters, that only they were the true chosen people of God who were really, truly preserving the legacy of the children of Israel. We've also found out that they were extremely, extremely messianic, but not about Jesus. But they were absolutely convinced that the Messiah was coming, but they were convinced he was coming back for them and them alone. And that's why eventually they began to forbid marriage and children. And they write extensively about who they felt was the teacher of righteousness who was coming. What's very interesting, there is no evidence. Now, some people think there is, because there was a little tiny strip of a Dead Sea Scroll found that some people think is part of a copy of Mark, the New Testament. But J. Randall Price says, no, it's not a part of Mark. There's no evidence. There's no evidence that the Qumranites ever had any knowledge of Jesus Christ, or that anybody in Jerusalem at the time in any way ever crossed paths or told them about Jesus. So what's really interesting about it, there's kind of a lesson here. They were so isolated and so radical and so adamant that the Messiah was coming back for them and them alone. When the Messiah really came, they never even heard about him. They totally missed out on it. Their writings are full of messianic prophecies, but because they believed that the world was ending soon, they decided at some point, we need to preserve these not just in our libraries. We need to create time capsules. We all know what time capsules are. You take some writings from today and you bury them in the ground, and then in 100 years somebody will dig them up and they'll get a little idea of what life was like in our time. So that's kind of what they had in mind. They said, we need to start hiding these. Now, why did they hide them? Because they believed the world was ending soon, and they needed to preserve and save the Word of God by hiding them in the caves around the city. And they may have been more right than they realized. The end was coming. The end of their world was coming. But it wasn't the Messiah coming back. It wasn't the apocalypse. It wasn't Armageddon. It was Rome. Eventually, Rome was going to come and destroy them all. And so it actually is good that they saved the Dead Sea Scrolls as much as possible. So like I said, in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. There is some evidence the Essenes, even though their city was invaded and destroyed and burned to the ground by the Romans, some of them did escape and was rejoined with other Jews during the Great Last Stand, when the Jews were finally wiped out as a people. There were some Essenes who escaped and were there at the mountain city of Masada, where the Jews made their final stand before Rome stamped them out completely, and they were scattered across the Roman kingdom. There were some Essenic Jews among them. So during the following persecutions, Rome tried to destroy all of the Torah. They tried to burn every copy of the Jewish Bible that they possibly could. And they did. They destroyed in huge heaps of fire. They were trying to purge the Jews from history. But it's almost like somehow God had his hand in the whole thing. And the Old Testament still managed to escape the Roman persecution, because over the years, so many of these scrolls had been hidden in the caves surrounding Qumran. So we have one final question. We know everything now. We've solved the mystery. We know who translated the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know who put them there. We know why they put them there. So to solve the final mystery, how accurate is the Masoretic text? Now you have to understand, the Masoretic text was the oldest text that we had. Now the Dead Sea Scroll is the oldest text that we have. And it's written in ancient Hebrew. Now, there were 2 more copies of the Old Testament before that, in between the two. We have the Pentateuch, which is a Samaritan translation of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Then we have, in 300 BC, the Septuagint was translated into Greek. And it's called the Septuagint because that refers to 70. And it is believed that 70 rabbis translated the Old Testament into Greek. This was actually for an Egyptian pharaoh. This is around the year 300 BC. So the Masoretic text was the oldest copy, but we did know that there were some in between. So we can say that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the Pentateuch, the Septuagint, then the Masoretic text. But what we're doing is we're comparing the Masoretic text to the Dead Sea Scrolls to see how much the Old Testament had changed over the years. So if you take the Dead Sea Scrolls, now it's kind of problematic to do this because not all of them were written at once. You'll have the oldest copy of different books of the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written in totally different time periods, some of them hundreds of years apart. But if you put the oldest copies of all of them together and you say, this is the oldest Old Testament we have now, and you compare it to the Masoretic text, the Masoretic text agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls 80% of the time. So the Masoretic text scores 80% as far as accuracy to the Old Testament. Now, I know what you're thinking, 80%, that's it? I thought the Bible was the Word of God that's been perfectly preserved throughout the generations. Brother Philip, you're destroying my faith here. Well, hold on just a second. Just a second. We'll talk about it. So, we can see that there was an evolution from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible, to the Pentateuch, to the Septuagint, to the Masoretic text. Because the Masoretic text was translated from these two, which no longer exist. So we can kind of see how some words got changed, translating from Hebrew to Samaritan to Greek to English, and then the Masoretic text. So we can kind of see how there was an evolution that takes place here. But if this number upsets you, only 80% accuracy. So when I'm reading the Bible, this is only 80% accurate to what the original Bible said? Not quite. Not so fast. We need to understand how ancient scrolls are looked at. And this leads us to a new definition. This is called a textual variant. This is a disagreement between original and newer manuscripts. Now, it isn't just in the Bible. This happens all the time in ancient text. So we're looking at the 20%. So I said there's an 80% disagreement. That means there's a 20% disagreement between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text. So what is the 20%? That's what we need to take a closer look at. Well, first of all, remember what I said earlier, the book of Esther is missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's already a big chunk of that 20% difference right there. The others, the vast majority of them are actually small to minor to almost not even being worth mentioning. They're spelling errors, or let me give you some examples. The vast majority of them are small textual variants that don't do anything to change the meaning of the text. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 say in Hebrew, the sons of Israel. The Masoretic text said sons of God. That's it. That's an example of a textual variant. It doesn't change the meaning of the text any. It's actually kind of a minor thing. There's another example. Exodus 1 verse 5. Well, so in the Dead Sea Scrolls we find the original oldest Hebrew Bible said 75 descendants. The Masoretic text says 70 descendants. So is your faith in the Bible built on whether or not there were 75 or 70 descendants? Mine isn't. And actually, if you look closer at them, you can see how that mistake would have been made between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text, because the 5 and the 0 look almost exactly alike. So you can see over the course of time how a scribe at some point carelessly would have mistranslated 70 instead of 75. All right, so that's the vast majority of that 20%. It's words that are spelled wrong, or it's a few minor, insignificant mistakes that don't actually change the meaning of the text. So what are some big ones? Is there anything really monumental and gigantic that disproves the Bible or proves that Judaism was changed or tampered with over the years? The largest textual variant we have is that in 1 Samuel 11 verse 1, the opening of the chapter of 1 Samuel 11, there's a paragraph missing. That's it. That is the biggest difference. It actually does not change the meaning of the text. There's a few things, most of it is stuff that's missing. There's original stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls that God accidentally left out when they, over the years leading into the Masoretic text. Judges 6 is an example. There's a few lines in Judges 6 that were not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so apparently this is an addition to the Masoretic text. But the real question is, these are minor mistakes. These are little insignificant changes that don't change the meaning of the text at all. So the real question is there anything in there that really changes anything significant, that changes doctrine? Are there any stories missing? The answer is no, there are none. There is no Judaic doctrine that's in jeopardy. There is nothing that has been changed that's of any significance. Every story, as it's told, is still perfectly preserved from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic text. So really, when we look at this, we look at the Masoretic text, which your Bible is probably based on, we should actually be amazed at how right they got it. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls is now viewed as one of the greatest discoveries that has supported the Bible, that has actually proven the accuracy of the Masoretic text. These two manuscripts are thousands of years apart, and they were translated from many different languages from one to the next. It's amazing they got as much right as they did. The heart of the story, the messages, the stories, the moral of the stories is still the same. It really never changed over the years. The only thing that changed was a few minor passages that didn't mean anything. A few words got spelled wrong from one to the next. And there is a book missing, Esther, and that's what that 20% is. So if you're holding a newer translation of the Bible, some of the really new ones that they've released in recent years, you can be rest assured that's based on the oldest copies of the Old Testament we found. But if you're like me and you're a traditionalist and you just like your good old King James Version, which was translated from the Masoretic text, you can also be rest assured you're holding a pretty good, accurate Old Testament. Something that has been pretty much proven and supported by the Dead Sea Scroll discovery. So that actually concludes the Dead Sea Scrolls. So when I make my ruling this week, the thing about it is, usually I say this story is confirmed or plausible or debunked from what we found. This time it really isn't the Dead Sea Scrolls that are on trial, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are what they are. They're the discovery. So it's actually the Masoretic text that's on trial, because most of the Bibles today are from the Masoretic text. So the Masoretic text, in my opinion, is now confirmed. It is confirmed as an accurate, pretty good, very reliable translation of the Old Testament as it was written thousands of years before. I think the Dead Sea Scrolls have been a tremendous discovery that have really given us very good evidence to support the reliability of the Old Testament as we have it. So that concludes the Old Testament. This is the 9th class in this series. We have 3 more to go. Y'all thought this was good, trust me, you ain't seen nothing yet. The New Testament classes that I'm putting together are just going to blow you away from this onward. But now let's take a look back and see how the Old Testament does overall. So I've looked back over everything we've talked about from beginning to today. I pronounced the Garden of Eden plausible. I pronounced Enoch plausible. The flood and the ark were both confirmed. I've seen enough evidence to support that these are both really things that happen in history. The Tower of Babel, confirmed. Abraham is plausible. We can't find any hard evidence for Abraham, but everything about the story of Abraham goes along with what we know of the time period. The Exodus was confirmed. Jericho was confirmed. The early kings of Israel were confirmed. The last kings of Israel were confirmed. The Ark of the Covenant, we don't have it, so I just ruled it plausible. And now the Masoretic text is confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. So overall, we have not been able to successfully debunk anything from the Old Testament. We have been able to confirm 7 out of 10 events from the Old Testament, and 3 out of 10 are still plausible. So overall, I am setting aside my bias, my belief in God, my beliefs as a Christian, researching the history just with a purely objective mind, using science and detective work and deductive reasoning. I pronounce the Old Testament is confirmed. I think we have enough of the Old Testament. We've seen enough of the stories that are now proven by the artifacts, by history, that we can safely say the Old Testament is a very, very thorough, reliable, historical document detailing events that took place in the ancient world. So now, how does the New Testament hold up? Well, you'll just have to come back next week to find out. Any questions tonight before I hand it back to the pastor? Ooh, I'm glad my voice held up. Dad?
Did they date these old scrolls by who they think wrote it, or by the where